I am Michelle Steiner. I'm a freelance content editor for Skeleton Key, and I'm here with author Brandon McNulty. Hello. And Brandon's most recent book came out in April 2024, The Half Murders. Congratulations.
Thank you, and thank you for being a part of it. You were a key member of the beta reading process.
Thank you. My pleasure. As I've always told you, it's like getting a free concert of your favorite band, and they ask, how do we sound? And you say, amazing. And here's why. So, I do want to say The Half Murders. I'm excited for other people to read it. I hope more people will hear about it through listening to the book fest. And it has, as usual, just really excellent characters you really care about, their struggles and their stakes, and a very unsettling supernatural element, which is what I've come to know you for.
Thank
Through
you.
your other few books as well. Just going to put this out there early on because we'll be discussing them today. Bad Parts and Entry Wounds as well. All right, so you and I do attend a lot of the same science fiction conventions. Recently, it was Confluence in Pittsburgh, and you did an entire panel on the works of Stephen King. That is a writer that we have in common, but it's not the writer that got you into writing horror and supernatural thrillers, is it?
No, no. So when I was a kid, and we're going far back to the 90s with R.L. Stein and his Goosebumps books, when I was in, I think, second grade, I had this daily habit of trying to get through my schoolwork as fast as possible so I could rip through another R.L. Stein book. And one of my favorites, well, I had a bunch. I mean, Monster Blood was incredible, but my absolute favorite was his book, The Haunted Mask. And it's important that I bring this up because my book, Entry Wounds, which is about a haunted gun, if you pick it up, you can't put it down till you kill 6 people with it. And the basic concept of having something stuck to your hand or stuck to your body was first introduced to me with that book, The Haunted Mask, because it was about this little girl. She was bullied as a kid, and she had this rough home life and everything like that. Everything was just not going her way. And one day she walks home from school. There's this mask shop, or it was like, it might have been some kind of like a Halloween shop, whatever. But she goes in there and she sees this horrifying, grotesque mask on the shelf, and she's like just drawn to it. She wants it because she wants to scare off the bullies and just, get some control in her life and everything like that. And she ends up buying the mask, and she puts it on, and she can't get it off. And it was, when it was, something I read as an 8-year-old, it was mind blowing. And even looking back now, it's still a very cool concept. And it was something that helped give me an idea for, okay, how do I write this unusual thriller, this supernatural thriller with this haunted gun? And it was something I stuck to as far as, like an inspiration throughout the process. And with the idea of Entry Wounds, it was always that haunted gun and the situation where, okay, he picks up the gun, he can't put it down until he kills 6 people with it. And in the Haunted Mask, she had the mask on until there was a certain emotional payoff toward the end that allowed her to remove it. Now, with my book, obviously, my books are adult horror, so they're a lot nastier and everything like that. And it was a situation where the character had to go through with his worst, nightmares of having to kill people, having to essentially become a serial killer over the course of 5 or 6 days, because the catch with the gun was you had to kill someone each day, or else you would start losing your mind and you'd be filled with murderous thoughts. But that was, I mean, for me, my favorite book to write was Entry Wounds because of the concept, because it essentially wrote itself. I mean, it was such a, just, I knew exactly what I needed to do with it. I needed to, find a character and then put him in a situation where he had to kill 6 different people, and he had to, he was a very moral person. So it wasn't just simply like, oh, rah, run out the door and shoot people. He had to, be calculating about it, who deserves to die, go through the moral struggles and everything like that. And having that strict framework of, okay, he has to kill 6 people. So I knew, this has to happen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And how am I going to do it? How am I going to mix in some twists along the way as well? That whole thing it just played out so well. I wish every book was as fun and easy to write as Entry Wounds, because the other 2 weren't. So
Yes, I do the Strange New Worlds online book club, and all the club members, they're reluctant to read something that feels too much like horror to them. It is a supernatural thriller, so I thought I could get that in sideways. We did read your book, Entry Wounds, and everybody loved the concept. They were very excited to see how it played out with him having to make a choice when a gun is stuck to his hand. Who is he going to use it on? How does he live with himself afterward? Can he not lose himself entirely? Can he make choices that he can live with? And putting yourself in that situation, as you inevitably, I think, do as a reader, I is one of the more engaging parts of reading, and how we can read something that scares us, but we don't have to go through it. We can process what we're feeling, because we can always close the book and put it down and come back later.
It's interesting you brought up the idea of putting yourself through that process, because when I initially wrote Entry Wounds, this was back in 2018. I had the very like the basic seed of the idea. Like I was reading a book one night, I was bored, and I was staring at the arm of my chair, and in my head I pictured this guy wandering around, and it was like in a high fantasy setting, and he had this gun, and it was attached to his hand, and he was just stuck with it. And it was like, oh, that'd be a pretty cool idea, but the problem is, like, I don't write high fantasy. I don't have the patience for the world building. And then a few days later, I like the idea was still sticking with me. I'm like, why don't I just tuck this into a contemporary setting? Why don't I see how that would work? Mm-hmm. And so I sat down and I wrote a very, very bad first draft of, at the time it was just called Gun Hand. And it was none of the characters who are in the actual book that you can read today were in it. It was just like, it was basically like me putting myself in the situation and trying to fictionalize it to an extent. And it was terrible, because anytime I write a book that, if the character is too much like me, I don't punish that character enough. I don't, push them to their limits. And also, like, I don't find myself to be a very interesting person. Like, I think the reason why I'm a writer is because I'm compensating for how boring I am in real life. But when I was writing that initial story, I wanted to figure out, what I could do with the concept and everything like that. And then obviously the characters I wasn't too excited about, but I wrote through that first draft, and that first draft, it was a mess. It was awful, and it didn't really go anywhere particularly interesting, but it allowed me to get familiar with the idea, to see what I could do with it. And then a year later in 2019, and this was after I had finished one of the drafts of Bad Parts, I wanted a break. So I got back to Gun Hand, as it was called at the time. And I wanted to just get a break from Bad Parts. So I wrote it again from start to finish, and I took some different ideas with it. And at the time, I had been playing a couple of video games that were set in Japan. And one of them was called Yakuza 0. The Yakuza video game series it's a lot like, it's like a crime drama, but it's also kind of silly, and the characters are stylish and funny and everything like that. And I had been playing this game, and it's based on like the Japanese mob and everything like that. And I was like, maybe I can work that into my story a little bit. And that's where that really first, it was the second draft of Entry Wounds, but it was the first really good one came to life once I started incorporating different ideas and, bringing in the Yakuza, and where do I work with that idea? How do I, bring it to a situation? Because I set most of my books in Pennsylvania. So I set all of them so far in Pennsylvania, but I needed a situation where, okay, how do we bring the Yakuza into this? And, they're mostly like, there's not a whole lot of information on the Yakuza in the United States, but I mean, typically they're in Hawaii or the West Coast. So that helped develop the idea. And then it put me in a situation where I was able to write characters that they had to go across the country, and they had to start killing people. And then the gun falls into the wrong hands, the hands of the protagonist, who, he's just an everyday guy. He's a school teacher. And now all of a sudden he's got this big problem that he has to solve.
Yes, I will say my favorite characters out of all of yours are the ones in Entry Wounds. Even the ones who behave villainously, they do so in such a fascinating way.
Yeah,
and for the most part, it's people kind of being corrupted. But
yeah, and I had so much fun with it, because with the characters, they were regular people who had been tossed into this ugly situation, and finding the right balance in terms of the morality, and okay, you have to do something terrible. uh, how are you going to go through it? How do you decide what is the best possible move? And then as they're doing terrible things, they start liking it at times, and it makes things a little more complex, a little messy in a good way, which is always when you go through the writing process. I think a lot of people think, especially like non-writers, they think that, okay, well, writers, they just have this outline, they figure out what they need to do, and then they just go through it. And some writers, they can pull that off. I can't. The way I go through things, I will have an idea, and I'll test out that idea, see how it goes. And then as I'm going through the writing process, I like to take risks. I like to gamble. I like to get messy, see where different things can play out. And there are positives and negatives to this. Positives are that you unleash creativity and you see things that you didn't initially see, like different potential outcomes or even subplots come to life. And then of course there's the downside where it's like, oh no, now I gotta fix all these problems I just created, and take care of the butterfly effect and all that, because you change one thing in a story and then that automatically changes 15 other things, and then you're editing left and right until it's over. But yeah, it was the whole idea of taking risks, gambling with what I'm doing during those early drafts. That's something that's really brought my stories to life, brought the characters to life as well. Because I think if you have a character who's just playing along with the script, that's no fun. But if you have a situation where you're writing a situation where they are supposed to be doing something, and then all of a sudden they do something they're not, that's where the story gets interesting. That's where the fun starts.
All right. So that is a little bit of the evolution of entry wounds. What about bad parts? A little bit about what the story is about, and then how it evolved from start to finish.
Okay. And Bad Parts, I have it over here, but Bad Parts, it's a small town horror story, supernatural thriller, and it's set in this uh, somewhat isolated Pennsylvania town. And basically, the people there for the past 30 years or so, they've been trading away their sick and injured body parts in order to get healthy again. And then what happens is this one woman, her name is Ash Hudson. She's a guitarist in a metal band. Her band is they're on the rise, and they're about to play this big show. And right before the show, she does like a warm up concert near her hometown. After the concert, she goes out to the parking lot and she gets attacked, and somebody, she doesn't see their face or anything like that, somebody just beats her up and busts up her left hand, which is of course the money hand if you're a guitarist. And that puts her in a situation where she's thinking to herself, okay, what do I do? And she goes back to her hometown hoping to replace her left hand. But the catch is that once you trade one of your body parts away, you can't leave town with it, or else it'll disappear. So if you had a situation where maybe you got lung cancer, you wanted to trade your lungs, like, yeah, you could go to this creek in the woods and you can take a dip in the creek and you'll be healthy again. But then if you try to leave the local area, it'll vanish right from your chest. So with her situation, she has to play a show down in Florida, and she trades her hand, but she wants to cut a deal with the demon in the water. And that's where the plot really kicks off in terms of trying to cut this deal, make things happen so she can keep the hand and leave. And with the whole writing process of Bad Parts, it was an interesting situation because back in 2015 was when I first got the idea. And I remember a buddy of mine found out I hadn't seen the movie Poltergeist. I think it came out in like 84, and he was a big fan of it. And I told him, like, yeah, I haven't seen it. He's like, oh, you have to go see it. You have to go see it. And he hyped it up so much. He's like, oh, you got to go see Poltergeist. So I watched it later that night, and I was underwhelmed because the hype was just off the charts. There was no way it could have ever lived up to it. But toward the end, there was one particular scene where the family's backyard just kind of collapses, or something just comes out of the ground, and it looked like a fist emerging from the ground. It was just that was just the way I interpreted it. And I was like, at the time I was like, oh, that might be a cool idea for like a flash fiction piece, like something like some hand just flying around, some haunted hand or something like that. And the next morning I wrote what was supposed to be a flash fiction, and it was just supposed to be like a few hundred words, and it ended up being this weird, dark fantasy kind of story. It wasn't bad parts. It wasn't like set in like small town Pennsylvania or anything. It was just this high fantasy thing that I wrote for like a month or two, and it was a disaster. But again, going back to those early drafts, those, you test things out, you see what the idea can do. And I had this concept of this. It was like this godlike creature that was, it had all its different parts taken away from it, and it had to get them back. And what happened was, I toward the end, there was like one of the main characters had to kill it or something like that. And it was a terrible first draft. There was nothing really great about it other than the concept and me toying around with this concept and seeing what I could do with it. Then fast forward a year later to, I think, spring or summer of 2016, I had finished writing this other book that I submitted the first, I want to say like 5,000, 10,000 words to this workshop, and it got rejected. So I was like, oh man, I need a spark. I need something different. And in my head, I came back to that idea of, the different parts and of this creature. And I envisioned it in like a small town setting and stuff like that. And all of a sudden things start falling into place. And at the time I was really inspired because I had gotten that rejection from the workshop. And it was like, it was like an I'll show you kind of situation. Like, yeah, I can write a novel. I can write something good. So I bunkered down and I wrote the first true draft of Bad Parts. And during that, it was a situation where I was kind of trying to write something inspired by Salem's Lot, which is my favorite Stephen King book. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Salem's Lot, it takes place in New England, and it's like a small town story, and the town gets overrun by vampires, and there's a lot of different characters, and they all have their own problems and things like that. And it's just, I love it to death. And it was a key source of inspiration for me. So as I'm writing this Bad Parts story, I'm like trying to figure out how do I, bring that feel of Salem's Lot into my own idea, my own world that I was creating here. And I was writing different things. And there was a situation toward the end of that first ugly draft of it where I felt like there wasn't enough cool stuff happening in the book. And I remembered there was one situation in Salem's Lot where a bunch of people died and everything like that. And I'm like, oh, I should do that too. So, I ended up having a bunch of characters in a situation where, there was lots of death, lots of horrible things happening. And that ended up being one of those things where it was like, okay, I don't know if I'm going to keep this. I don't know if it can work, but it was just me having fun with it, seeing where things would go. And then later, when I came back a few months afterward and started writing the second draft, I started building around that plot point. And throughout the different drafts I went through, and Bad Parts had a ton of drafts because that was the novel where I learned essentially how to write a novel. That was the first one I released. So I wrote the first draft, I scrapped that, then I settled in on that second one, and I really started, focusing things, bringing things to life, bringing major characters to life, because I had certain character major, like one of the main characters, Carl. He was originally just the cop, and then there was another cop on the force who was Ash's father, Ash being the main character. And in the first draft, there were two separate cop characters, and then I just blended them into one, and I made Carl Ash's adopted father. So there were a lot of things that happened between drafts. And I think when you have that opportunity to take a step back from what you're writing and ask yourself, like, okay, what's working here and what is it? And I knew that I needed a cop character for certain plot events to happen. And I knew that I really liked Carl as a character. I thought he faced some interesting challenges over the course of the story. And it was like, okay, well, the other cop, not so much. So I combined the two, and that ended up being the second major character in the story. And another interesting thing, Ash's brother in the finished version of the book, his name is Trent. He's he has a leg injury that's been it's been a problem for, I think, maybe 5-6 years or 10 years. It's been a while since I wrote the book. So, but I think it was 10 years prior to the events of the story. He had this leg injury that was caused by Ash. And in the original draft, like this Trent guy, he was just like an ex-boyfriend of hers, and he didn't have any injury at all. And then as I got into it, I got into that second draft, I said to myself, I have to make sure all these characters have an injury. They have something that they need to trade in order to get stuck in this town. So I gave him the leg injury, and I added that to the backstory, and that fleshed out Ash and him a little bit. But at the time, he was still just an ex-boyfriend of hers, and it wasn't until I got some feedback from Ellen Brock, who's an editor. She also has a YouTube channel. She's fantastic. But in 2018, I won a contest called RevPit. I got to work with her, and she wrote this 10-page edit letter where she just burned bad parts to the ground. And it was just like, at that point, I thought I had a pretty good story, and she just tore it apart. And she said, I am not connecting with this Trent character. There's got to be something else you can do with him, make him more interesting in it. And what I realized was that, family was a theme in Bad Parts, because it took place around Thanksgiving. You had Ash returning to her hometown. She hadn't spoken to her father in years. You had other families struggling throughout the story. And I figured, why not just take Trent, this ex-boyfriend who really doesn't have that much of a stake in her life? Why not just make him her brother and create this little bit of a sibling rivalry? And from there, things just took off in terms of the 3 point of view characters. But beyond that, it was a process where, just fine tuning it, figuring out how to make those characters work, how to fit them into the situation while keeping the situation interesting. I like to keep my plots tight, so that drives me nuts from time to time, because with the butterfly effect, again, anytime you change something, you have to change 15 other things, and that can mean deleting chapters, adding chapters, revising chapters. But the process of writing Bad Parts was messy because it was such a learning experience for me. And there were different pointers I received along the way from people who were mentors to me, and of course beta readers I got a lot of feedback from in the middle stages of the process as well as the late stages of the process.
Excellent. And I have to say, I do love where you ended up in Bad Parts with that family dynamic, Ash and her father, Ash and her brother, even the brother and Ash struggling to reconnect with Trent's son, who had his own injury and his own need for the demon's help, that his certain family members were very ambiguous about letting a child accept the demon's help and what that might mean for the child. It created a very interesting tension, because you could see both sides of the argument so clearly.
Yeah, one thing I've learned through the years is that anytime you have a cast of characters and they're not gelling, turn somebody into a family member. And usually the easiest way to do it is just make somebody a sibling or whatever it is, or even like a nephew, niece, some kind of dynamic there, because family there's always going to be baggage. There's always going to be also that need to stand up for each other, to go through war together, whatever it would be. And you can never discount the family dynamic. I mean, I think as far as like bridging 2 characters together, that's something I always go to in my stories.
Yes, you can do so much with family and second chances. You understand why someone keeps giving more chances to their family over someone else, just inherently. And you do very well with that in Entry Wounds as well. The main character, Ken, has a brother who just keeps letting the family down. He has an addiction, and they want to keep asking him sometimes, because he's the only one who can sometimes step in when Ken can't be there for their father. But at the same time, they're not so sure that this time he will really be able to stay sober long enough to be helpful and be there for the family.
Yeah, and the sibling relationship in Entry Wounds was also something that it was there from the start, but it was something I needed to develop over the course of the story. One time, I think after I had like a really good polished draft, I sent it to a good friend of mine, Vic. He's an editor and he helps me out with a lot of stuff. But he pointed out to me that there was a situation where Ken did something terribly wrong to Robbie, his brother. Ken's the main character, Robbie's his brother. And it was one of those things where Vic pointed out to me that, hey, there should be some kind of consequence here. And at the time there wasn't. It was just like the story just kind of went along. And then he pointed this out to me and I'm like, you know what? I should have a scene where Robbie beats up Ken. And it was one of those moments that it was one of the few scenes I added in the late stages of the process, but it brought the story to life. It brought their relationship to life in a much more significant way because of that violence. And it's a very violent book. And I think, having different characters engage in violence in different ways. And Robbie, he's not the one with the gun, so he's not going around killing people, but having him punish Ken for something that he's done, it brought that family dynamic to life.
Oh, yes. And sometimes Robbie wanted to choose whom Ken would shoot, and Ken would be reluctant to go along with it.
Yeah, it was a lot easier to tell somebody who they should do versus when you're the one actually holding the gun in that book. So.
100%. Now, we haven't talked as much about your latest book, The Half Murders. I don't know if that's something that we could also slide into the topic of beta readers during the feedback and revision process.
Yeah, I mean,
how that went.
This is definitely the time to talk about you because you were such a key player during the mid and late stages of that process. One thing I forgot to mention when I was writing Bad Parts, I had won Pitch Wars back in 2017, which was like a contest where you got to submit your manuscript to, and if you were lucky enough to get selected, a mentor would work with you. And my mentor was Natasha Rollerson. She's an author. She does like dark romance and stuff like that. And she loved the idea of Bad Parts back when it was in I think second or third draft stages. And one of the things she critiqued for me was she said that, these characters, they need to be more human. They need to be more emotional at times and things like that. And she kept picking that apart for me. And she also gave me pointers on where to make them more emotional. And I think the interesting thing with The Half Murders was when I sent it to you for feedback, you stepped into that role of being the person who tells me, okay, these people need to be treated like human beings from time to time. I think there was a situation, and The Half Murders, I'll just give you a brief pitch for it, it's about a woman and her daughter. They go into this haunted house and they get chopped in half across the waist. And when they wake up next to these doppelgangers, and they get stuck in this situation where they have to navigate this world where, all of a sudden they have a double running around, and, can you trust that double? And then on top of that, there's someone from the main character's past who is trying to punish her for a crime she committed. So this was a very dark book, and it was also, there was a lot of like horror elements and thriller elements, and I was trying to, keep up the pace and everything like that. And you kept pointing out things like, there's one situation where the main character, she locks her doppelganger inside a garden shed. And I think after a certain point, she realizes she has to team up with the doppelganger. So they team up, and you're like, wait a minute, she's been locked in a shed for 2 days. She would need a shower, some food and everything like that. I'm like, oh, you're right. Because I had a situation where it's like, oh, let's go to the next scene. Let's get this plot rolling. And you're like, hold on. Like this is a human being. Let's treat her like one. And I'm like, okay, that's fair enough. Because I think with me, a lot of times during the drafting process, I get so lost in, figuring out the plot and making sure the plot is clicking along and it's not boring everybody. And when you're doing that, when you're focusing so much on, lining up the events and making things happen and cutting the fat and, trimming things here and there, when you do that, you miss like the smaller moments that need to be there. And you were so clutch because the amazing thing about you as a beta reader, you are not afraid to just put comment after comment after comment, speak your mind on anything. And it's something that I just totally appreciated throughout the entire revision process, because you were never shying away from saying something like, okay, this character, after an event like this, they would have to recover, or this character after an event like this, they would feel terrible, or, so on and so on. And all those little emotional moments, they not only bring the story to life, but they also make it more credible, more believable. And you need that with a story that's 300 pages. I mean, sometimes you could get away with that in a very short story where characters are acting wild and stuff like that, and things are moving on at a crazy pace. But when it's something that occurs over the course of 300 pages, and you have characters getting chopped in half, and then they have to react to the situation, and then they got people trying to track them down and hunt them down and things like this, and there's all these different things going on, you have to pull back now and again and remind the audience that these are human beings and these are people we can relate to and that we should care about. And that was, for me, you being a part of the process and pointing those things out for me, that was just absolutely clutch.
You know, I remember my main feedback being, I empathize with your main character in the Half Murders because she's trying to reconnect with her estranged daughter.
Yeah.
And that was just so impactful for me that I was rooting for her from the first. But then when she was interacting with her doppelganger, she was becoming so much less sympathetic. And I'm like, you're becoming the villain of your own
Yes.
story. So no,
That's a very good point. Yeah. And that's something I find with with all three of my books, I've had people, especially in the earlier drafts, tell me that, okay, there are times where I stop liking this character or I, just outright hate this character. And I have to go back and I have to think about audience. And I think that's a big thing. Whenever you are writing a novel, you have to always think about, how is the audience going to feel? And are you, do you want them to feel that way? And when I was writing these stories, I definitely wanted the characters to be sympathetic. And yes, they do some crazy things from time to time. They do some dark things from time to time. But I was not going for a situation where I wanted them to be loathsome. And, thinking about audience at different stages of the process, like sometimes I will just let it rip during those early drafts and, find out what kind of cool things happen. What are some dark things characters are going to do that are going to really move the needle and grip the audience. But at the same time, you have to have that balance. You can have them do something wild and crazy and, something morally gray. But if you want that character to still be somewhat likable and engaging, you have to figure out, okay, what reason is there for the audience to, at the very least, empathize with the character, or potentially sympathize with them, or just outright like them. And with my stories, I definitely have like my heroes are usually darker. I think Ash would be more of an anti-hero, and then with Ken and Kelly from the Half Murders, they at times feel like anti-heroes. Maybe Ken, I think, develops into one more so than the others, but it's always difficult to figure out, okay, where does the audience, or how do they feel about a character at a certain point in the story, and do I want them feeling negative thoughts toward that character? Are they still going to be attached to them? And I've had situations where my beta reader said, like, okay, you lost me here because I gave up on the character. I stopped being invested in them. And I think you with this most recent book, you kept bringing that up at different times throughout the story, and I had to reflect on that and decide how I wanted to present the character. Do I want them being someone who is going to turn off a certain portion of the audience, or is there a way where I can have them walk that fine line between, okay, they're doing dark things, but they're also still, the audience is still on their side, so to speak, because they have the right motivation or the right goal or whatever it is.
Yes, the main character needs room to grow, but also room to fall. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just make the villain a little more villainous by what they do, and that makes your hero more sympathetic by contrast. Mm-hmm. And you definitely succeed with that in the Half Murders. I stopped sympathizing with a certain character at a point because they've revealed this darker, more selfish side, and some of it you understand because of what they've been put through, but some of it just comes across as evil and vicious.
Yeah, and you brought up reaching that point where the villain starts being more villainous, and I think it's important to get to that point with the hero. If the audience is on board with the hero up until that point, then it works. But if the audience, they say, I'm done with this character, I can't stand them anymore, and there's still 200 pages left, then that's a problem. So I always have to take those things, take stock in that during, in between drafts or during revisions, whatever it is, and ask myself, okay, I like darker heroes, but how dark are we going to go?
Mm-hmm. So speaking of darkness, one of the most basic advice that they give to someone who decides they're going to write horror or something adjacent like supernatural thriller is put your real fears in there. So how have you put your real fears into these novels?
Okay, so I think With bad parts, the interesting thing was back in my early 20s, I was a big runner. Like I used to run like every single day, like 3, 5, 7 miles, whatever it was. And I loved running until all of a sudden my knees started bothering me. And my fear was that, oh man, I'm going to not be able to walk someday, or I'm going to be, in a wheelchair or whatever, like whatever it was. And so I gave up running and I switched to an exercise bike and things like that. But, when I was going through those fears and thinking about my future, thinking about my health and things like that, it was around that time where I started coming up with the idea for trading those body parts and everything like that. And also, just friends, family, they have their own health issues, and you fear for them, you fear for their future and things like that. And that's where the idea really came to life, like figuring out how to connect emotionally to the characters in bad parts and their health situations and things like that. And they have maybe some incurable illness, or they have some kind of injury that can't be healed, or things like that. And it was that fear, my own, just a simple fear of, oh man, I can't run like I used to in my teens and early 20s. Like that simple fear was something that I injected into the story, and it fueled the story. And with Entry Wounds, it was more so a thriller than a horror story, but I think there was a certain fear of being passed over at that time, because I had some struggles with trying to get an agent for bad parts. Like I had submitted to all these different agents, and one of them was like really on board, and then she dropped it, and it was like, oh man, and it was just like I felt like I had been left behind and things like that. And like the character of Ken, who's the main character in Entry Wounds, he was in a situation where he was a school teacher, he was a substitute, he was trying to get that full-time job, and then there was a situation where nepotism took over, and like the principal gave it to her daughter's boyfriend or something like that. And Ken had that deep-seated fear of, oh man, what am I going to do with my life? What's going to happen to me now? And at the same time, he's also taking care of his father. His brother's a heroin addict. So there was all those things going on with his personal fears. And I kind of injected my own into that, the fear of the future. I think my books tend to have like this anxious energy, because I'm always like, oh no, what's going to happen in 3 years or 5 years? Or what am I going to do in like 20 years from now? How am I going to survive and things like that? And that anxious, what will happen next, was a big part of Entry Wounds and Ken's personal struggles. And then with the half murders. So the background on the half murders, I don't know if I told you this, Shell, but I had been writing a sequel to Bad Parts for 2 years, and it was a mess. And I kept trying to get back into it, trying to force it. And it never came to fruition. And every time I finished it, it was like, no, this isn't working. And then I sent it off to one beta reader, and he's normally like a brutal guy, and he'd be like, oh, this is, here's all these different things wrong with your book. Like when I send him like a good book, that's what he says. And then when I sent him that Bad Part sequel, he was like, I think this is good. And I knew something was off. As soon as he said it was good, I knew, okay, there's a problem here. But what happened was, I had gotten to the point where that Bad Part sequel was it was wearing me down so much. And it really kind of destroyed me, like in an internal civil war, like Brandon versus Brandon. And it's like, I stopped trusting myself and trusting my ideas and my writing process and things like that, because I had so many failures with that sequel. And that was where this idea for the half murders of somebody getting cut in half, and then they're at odds with their doppelganger, that's where that came in. And it was that fear of like, will I ever be able to make peace with myself? Will I ever be able to overcome the fact that I had gone down this wrong path with Bad Parts 2, and it was a waste of time and it went nowhere, and now I have nothing to show for it? Will I be able to forgive myself? And like there was that fear that no, I won't be able to. And that's what kind of fueled the story, that anger at myself, and like, how am I going to get past this and things like that. And Kelly, the main character, has to deal with that. And so I mean, going back to the idea of just general fears fueling a story, usually I like to fuel a story. Like once I find that idea, I try to attach some kind of emotion that's bothering me in the current moment, whether it's desperation or anger or self-hatred or whatever it could be. I take that emotion, I inject it into the story, I use that to fuel the idea, to build the story, build the plot, let the plot events, show what's going on internally for the characters and how they're expressing that desperation or anger or whatever it is. But I know, I think it was Ray Bradbury. He used to write a list of all the things he was afraid of. And every single day he would write a new story based on one of those fears. And he'd go through the list one by one. And that's where he came up with a lot of his good horror stories, was just figuring out something that scared him and writing a story about it. He didn't even have like a plan for it. He would just be like, okay, I'm afraid of this, I'm writing the story, and then he'd get something good out of it. So fear, especially if you are writing horror or thrillers, thrillers, usually you have a situation where characters are being, chased down by some kind of villain or chased down by some kind of enemy. So fear can be a great driving factor in the writing process.
Excellent. Funny enough, when I looked at the half murders, I saw more echoes of my first Stein, and the one that stayed with me was Stay Out of the Basement. The idea that this is the children's father, but not their father. So the idea that the doppelganger is the two children's mother, but not their mother, was really freaking me out. And how that uncertainty would just completely throw you if you were confronted with that this is not the person you recognize, and all of that trust and all of that relationship, you can't rely on any of it.
Yeah, that was
completely different territory.
The interesting thing with the half murders, I really needed to figure out how far I wanted to go with the doppelganger and how much I wanted her involved in Kelly's life and Kelly's home life and things like that. And I think the best decision I made was to limit the entire book to Kelly's point of view, because I didn't want any confusion as to who was who or anything like that. And I knew early on in the writing process that I could potentially have a situation where you jump back and forth between the two different perspectives. But if I did that, it could get very annoying for the reader and very confusing for the reader. And by limiting it to Kelly's point of view, not only did I have clarity, but we also didn't see what was going on behind the scenes with her doppelganger, K2, as she's called in the book. And that allowed for some great tension, some great suspense, and some great surprises. And especially with her home life, Kelly has a husband and two kids. And what happens when K2 bumps into the husband, or what happens when the kids see K2? How does that play out? And that again, going back to how we talked about creating those messy situations where it makes the story unique, it makes the story fresh, and it allows you to have some fun with it. That was a big part of it right there, was allowing K2 to just pop in and have a situation where, okay, here's a surprise, here's something Kelly didn't see coming, because, and then also the reader didn't see coming, because they're grounded in Kelly's point of view.
Right. Now, there was a Stephen King quote that I found when we were going to do this that was, he says, when you rewrite, your main job is taking out all the things that are not the story. But I watched your writing channel video, 5 Mistakes I Made While Writing My First Novel, and you talk about how it's not so much what you shaved away as what you expanded. Can you talk more about that?
And this goes back with Bad Parts. Interestingly enough, though, I think rather than trimming little things, I had to cut major things in Bad Parts, because I had like an entire second half to that book that was built on like a major plot twist. And what I did, I took that plot twist and I shifted it to a later point in the story. And that enabled me to flesh things out in the early and middle stages more so. So it was a situation where I realized that, okay, now that I've moved this plot twist, I'm going to have more room at the beginning of the story. And now I have time to actually develop these characters a little more, make them more human, make them more interesting, more believable. And that's where I started developing the relationships between Ash and her adoptive father and her brother and all those important things along the way. And another thing, Ash's relationship with her nephew kind of sprouted out during that time. He was in the early drafts, he was just kind of like a kid who was there, and he was a little more of a plot device. But once I fleshed things out a little bit, that's when he became more of a character and more important to the story as a whole.
No, I appreciate none of your characters feel like plot devices to me, including your children, because I do see other writers fall prone to that where the children doesn't really need to be there. And they just shuffle them off and you never hear from them again after a point. So I don't like that. And so I like that you really integrated that character into the story, and it was just so emotionally fraught and intense and wonderful.
Yeah, and sometimes like you bring a kid into a story, it adds a whole new dynamic to it because of the innocence, and they're not going to be like a darker character. So we just go, or I just go with that sometimes and bring it in and try to not only humanize the adult characters with that kid, but also try to bring them to life as well and have them factor into the story in a meaningful way.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I believe we are at the end of our time. I've really enjoyed being here at the Book Fest Fall 2024. Everybody stay tuned for more of the Book Fest's events and content. It's going to be an adventure, and it's good to be along, and I hope you still are too.
Yeah. And Shel, thank you so much for doing this. Awesome questions and an awesome talk. Thank you.
All right, well, please go out and read Brandon McNulty's 3 novels. They are excellent. They are intense. They will stay with you.